Right, Psalm 74, let's call this one Forever, this time with a question mark in this psalm that begins in verses 1 and 2 with a question. Why, God, have you cast us off forever? Remember your congregation and your Mount Zion, as in verses 3 through 8. He goes on to describe them as perpetual ruins. Why? Because the enemy has destroyed, roared, set up their own signs, broken down, burned, profaned, and presumed that all these things they have done to God's dwelling place are going to allow them to subdue Israel completely, which is going to seem to be made worse in verses 9 through 11, where he says there are no signs, there's no prophet, and no one who knows how long this will carry on, why God is not restraining them, and why he doesn't just flat out destroy them in response to what they have done to his people and his sanctuary, as verses 12 through 17 are going to go on to say, essentially, nevertheless, God is still my king, recalling, similar to what we saw in some of the Psalms of David, what God has done that would provide him confidence that he might come through again for them. Saying this time, he recalls the way that he works salvation, that he divided the seas in past generations, crushed Leviathan, and has fixed the boundaries on the earth, or just fixed boundaries in general. So he'll go on in verses 18 through 21 to say, remember, God, how the enemy and the foolish are scoffing. No matter how angry you are at your people, what's going on now is giving your enemies reason to cheer. Therefore, in verses 22, I guess, through 23, he's going to conclude with the prayer that asks God, or really seems to demand that God arise, because the foolish and the foes are getting way too much mileage out of what's going on with Israel right now. And that whole prayer, where it seemed that he was making more of a demand of God than an appeal to God, reminded me of a couple of things. One, the way that Samson prayed, meaning by the time Samson prayed, he didn't seem to be so good at it, quite possibly because he had gotten by for so long on his strength that actually humbling himself to ask anything, even of God, was not second nature to him. And so by the time he actually got around to praying to God, it sounded more like a demand, representing the distance between Samson and God, before he finally got to a point where he learned to pray with more humility, but only after he had suffered significant and tragic loss. Likewise, in this chapter, we seem to see the children of Israel having grown distant from God, and that might be indicated by the way in which the psalm seems to end up with a prayer that sounds more like a demand. One of the other reasons why it seems like they've grown distant from God is the degree to which he's speaking in hyperbole, meaning exaggerated dramatic language, when he is saying, why have you cast us off forever? It's not forever. More importantly, he's describing them in, like we said, verses 3 through 8 as perpetual ruins. Once again, the ruins are not forever, no more forever than their condition, which is something they would know if they had listened to the prophets like Jeremiah, who gave them a specific warning, one of a number of prophets who gave them a warning about the fact that they were about to be taken off into captivity. And moreover, Jeremiah was one who gave them a duration, helping them understand how long it would last. And that was the basis by which Daniel discerned the end, or the time period during which the captivity was supposed to be over. However, we have to remember that these Psalms are not always an indication of God's perfect wisdom, as much as they are sometimes a representation of the way in which God's people struggle to understand in times when they have grown distant from him, which is one of the reasons why we sometimes like to recall that wrapped up in God's commands are his counsel and likewise his wisdom. And so in this situation where they are wondering why, it comes next to a psalm where the psalmist is wondering why, but they are two very different whys. Why? Because the previous why comes in a time when any of us would simply be scratching our heads. This, however, is what we have described before as needless suffering, meaning they are in a period of uncertainty because they are either unaware or they have lost track of an answer that God has already given, which is why we sometimes say God's best to you as you go forward in him, understanding that even though God's commandments can seem burdensome, when we reject or simply neglect his commandments, we're also losing his counsel.